Our first presenter this morning is Erin Hardnett. Erin attends Yale Divinity School, where she is pursuing her Master's of Arts in Religion with a concentration in religions in the African diaspora. Her presentation is titled On Heaven and Wilderness, African American Eschatology and the Natural World. So the floor is yours, Erin.
Thank you so much, Claire. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes, I can give you, I'm going to make you a co-host now. So then now you should be able to see like the screen sharing button at the bottom. Do you see that?
Wonderful.
Okay.
No. Can you all see this?
I can see it.
Wonderful.
Oh, Erin, you're muted.
At some point, I'll learn how to use Zoom. Thank you so much, Claire. Alrighty, so my name is Erin Hardnett, as Claire said, and my presentation today is titled On Heaven and the Wilderness, African American Eschatology and the Natural World. Okay, so first I want to start with positioning myself. So on the left, you'll see a picture of me and my grandmother, Belter Span, and on the right, you'll see a picture of me, my grandmother, and my mother at my house in Marietta, Georgia. This picture is probably from 2000, and the other picture is probably more around 2011, before my grandmother passed. And I believe that it is important to introduce you to these women, because they are the women who shaped and molded me and taught me how to perceive the world. They taught me to perceive the world through a Christian lens. They taught me how to know God. And my mother and grandmother both grew up in rural Louisiana, while I grew up in a more suburban setting in Marietta, Georgia. And in both of these areas, there is a lot of nature. I saw deer and hawks running through my backyard in Georgia. And when I would go to visit my grandmother in Zachary, Louisiana, there also was similar nature. Yet in childhood, as I was learning to know God and learning to know myself, I never located God in the natural environment. I saw the things as very separate. It was not until the end of last year, probably around October, when I was having a conversation with my mom about this picture of a tree that I saw. Because, you know, fall is wonderful in the Northeast and you can really experience the seasons. And I saw this tree, and it was during a time in my life when I was really trying to find myself, trying to know if I was going down the right path, if academia was for me. And I was struggling, to be frank. And I sent this picture to my mom and I said, in this moment, I know God is here. This tree really was a connector between God and I. And my mother had also sent a video to our family group chat earlier that month of her going to the beach.
Put your head under there. Put your head under. Go put the head under. Hold your bubble. Hold a bubble.
So she sent this picture to the group chat, or to this video to the group chat, and in the background you'll hear my stepdad encouraging her to like go deeper into the ocean, even though my mom cannot swim, so she's actually afraid of the water. And she and I had a conversation about this later on, and she said in that moment she really felt a reminder of God's love. But after I had encountered this tree, I retroactively asked her, so do you think that this was just a reminder of God's love or an actual encounter with God? And in that moment, I came upon the driving questions of this particular presentation. Okay, so the first question is, why hadn't I located God in the natural environment before this moment? And the second was, historically, has there been a connection between African American religious practices and the natural environment? To address the first question, why hadn't I located God in the natural environment before? We turn to the way that Christianity teaches us to consider the body and land. So with the body, a prevailing understanding of the body and spirit is through this idea of Cartesian dualism. And Cartesian dualism basically says that the mind and the body are separate, and the mind is inherently superior. It is exalted. It is what receives information from God, and you are supposed to restrict and control the body through the guidance that you receive through your mind. Also with the body, Christians have had an issue with the body as it was in reference to Christ. So Christ's body was problematic. Is Christ a human? Is Christ fully God? And this was a large debate in early Christianity. And more recently, by more recently, I mean like since colonization, there was like a doctrine of infant depravity, which essentially said that you are born into a sinful state. And contemporarily, we may also see like control of the body through things like purity culture and the way that women are regulated in the church. And Christians' perceptions of the land. We oftentimes understand the land through these possessive and progressive logics in which we own land, and the purpose of us owning land is to cultivate land so that it might be productive. And in early colonial Christianity, this also was bolstered through what was known as the doctrine of discovery, which essentially said that land that was occupied by non-Christian people was essentially unoccupied. It was land that was available to be possessed, even if it had people living on it. Those people only had the right to sell the land to the Christians, or that land could just be taken. So again, land was just something to be possessed and to be controlled and to be regulated, just as the body was to be controlled and to be regulated. So through Christian logics, there is this inherent disconnect between body and mind, and also person and land. So we're supposed to be separate. And through this understanding, I could better understand the idea that why I hadn't located God in the natural environment earlier. So now we get to the titular slide, heaven and the wilderness. In James Cone, The Spirituals and the Blues, he makes this assertion: heaven for the enslaved referred to Africa, Canada, and the northern United States. And this, he's naming all of the sites, all of the physical sites on earth where enslaved people might be able to find freedom from enslavement. And it is implicit in this that for enslaved people, it was just important to, heaven was in the here and now, just as it was in the hereafter. Heaven was not something that you waited until death to experience. It is something that you experience in the here and now. But a notable absence from Cone's locations of heaven is the natural environment. And here we come to Dolores Williams, where in Sisters in the Wilderness, she says, the wilderness was a friend and often sheltered and fed the runaway slave. Here we note that for enslaved people, the wilderness also could have been a location of freedom. It was a place where people could go and have community gatherings for spiritual practices or just for sociality. Also, the natural environment was a location to escape into. It is a less commonly discussed practice, but it did happen. Like, yes, there was an Underground Railroad that went north, and also an Underground Railroad that went south, but also some enslaved people went into places like swamps to find freedom from enslavement. And in this, we get to the idea, the figure of the maroon. So maroon is both a verb and a noun. When it is used as a verb, we most often think about it as like Pirates of the Caribbean, Johnny Depp marooned on an island. It is to be abandoned. So in this context, we can think about enslaved people as having been marooned on the American continent, abandoned on the American continent, captured from Africa, and forced into labor in foreign land, not knowing how to seek freedom. And also maroon can be seen as a noun. Etymologically speaking, it derives from the Spanish word cimarron, which originally meant to refer to livestock that had been escaped, livestock that was broken, livestock that was wild. And when it came to be referred to enslaved people who had escaped, it was under this perception that enslaved people who went into the wilderness were unregulated Black people, scary Black people who had essentially escaped the social order. In the book, The Slave in the Swamp, William Cohen indicates that the perception of Maroons were that they were incredibly terrifying because they were these Black bodies that were unregulated. So here we see that maroonage is an alignment with nature in which we find freedom. So moving forward, as you might imagine, this project is in its nascent form, and I'm still thinking through how nature can be a location of freedom for contemporary Black people. And in the future, I hope to have interviews and conversations with Black people to see how we can experience nature in its fullness, to have a spiritual encounter with nature and a spiritual encounter with God, and potentially find freedom. Thank you so much.
Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm looking forward to doing the Q&A at the end and hearing more of your thoughts. Thank you to all of our presenters for kind of working with our technical difficulties. And we're going to move into Q&A now. So if the audience has Q&As, feel free to raise your hand and you can ask a brief question or type your Q&A in the chat. All right, so I can ask the first question and then we can move into a more dynamic form of Q&A. I had noticed, and I would like all of the presenters, if you wish to respond to this, that there was an aspect of the power of art to connect to not only nature, but to ourselves, and to connect to joy in our environment. And I'm wondering if you can all talk a little bit more about the power of visual forms, musical forms of art, and also their materiality in your work, and how you see that influencing your work.
So I can go. All of the images, well, 75% of the images in the presentation was de Gaulle's paintings. So, and he said this, when we're in line with nature, we have these creative outpourings, and this is just what happens as a spontaneous ability, because we're aligned. There isn't that excessive need to run after things. That creativity is in us, and it comes out when we're in balance with everything.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering about the paintings in the backgrounds of your slides. So thank you for that. Tyler or Erin, do you want to speak to that, or we can move on to Marie-Angie comment?
Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah, I appreciated both what Natasha and Erin had shared. Very lovely presentations. Thank you. A common thread that I was sensing was the potency of art and poetry and literature to change the way that we think about the world, our place in it, the relationships that we hold. And we've seen all around us the power of myth to break down relationships and community. And so, yeah, I think it's a worthy direction to try to experiment with.
Great, thank you.
And just to add to that point, that's a really good point, Taylor. It feels almost as if art and music and myth and story are the things that really can change us. Policy and all of the politics doesn't really make, I mean, it's there and we know it and it scares us, but what really touches us is the art and the music and the myths, and that's what has the power to make real change, I think.
And Natasha, I really appreciate the fact that you brought up the importance of storytelling, because in traditions that center orality, telling our story is so important, and the power of the written word doesn't have as much relevance. So in my project, I am really interested in actually hearing about people's experiences and hearing people tell the story of themselves in the natural environments where they live.
Wonderful. And then Marie Ange, am I saying your name correctly? Can you please tell me? Okay. But you wrote, I'm struck by the resonances between Tagore and Barry, especially the motif of trees. Would you like to elaborate on this, Natasha and Tyler? Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you for your comment.
So trees are such an important thing in Tagore's life. And as I read more about many thinkers in this kind of category, this mystical kind of category, trees, nature, it's all so interconnected. It's not, and it's almost as if it crosses race. It's almost as if it crosses place. It's like when you get to a certain level of personal realization, of self-realization, the natural world just becomes so much more alive to us. And I feel like as I was listening to Tyler, it's that kind of inner work that will bring out this realization of the connection of man and nature. And I think that goes across borders and across, it's a human journey.
Yeah, that's a great question. Listening to Natasha's presentation, what stood out to me about trees is trees provide a different sense of progress. I believe one of the lines was that for trees, progress is an inner progress of life. And I see a connection between that and Barry's idea of creation being imbued with life sustaining, life giving, and life celebrating as well. And so I wonder if trees could be a way of really exploring different ways of reinterpreting what progress is, what the flourishing and good life is within a global community.
Thank you. Erin, I have a question for you. I think I'm wondering how, as your work and as you grow as a scholar, which is really cool for me to see, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about lament and joy in historical Maroon communities, and then how that relates to what you said about the perceived danger of the unregulated Black body in our current religion and ecology sphere.
I'm sorry, something weird just happened to my computer. I can't see y'all anymore.
Okay, we can see you. And did you
Okay.
hear my question?
You said how lament and joy
played into kind of your research in Maroons historically, and then maybe how, because you had mentioned that that there is a perceived danger of the unregulated Black body, and how that might play into kind of developments in religion and ecology.
Okay, yes, thank you. So that's an interesting question. So this might not be directly answering your question, but I'm thinking about the unregulated Black body in this sense. And as I've been thinking through this project, I have been thinking about the way that we live in a constructed world, a world that, as it was mentioned in the other two presentations, like, is very much constructed around this myth that humans, have produced. And the idea of the unregulated body is is choosing to align oneself with that which with the natural environment, which cannot ultimately be controlled, because it continues to develop even and despite our intervention. And so you said like lament and joy. I don't know if I have actually thought about that. I do think a lot about experience. I do think a lot about, but not in like those terms. I'm sorry if I am not very clear in answering your question, but I don't actually think that that's something that I've thought so directly about.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, Zachary, do you have a question? We have about 2 minutes left. So.
Yeah, I was just following up with a few of these questions. I wasn't able to catch the first part of the talk, so I don't know if this was answered, but I feel like this idea of like this connection to trees is something that I wanted to eke out a bit in terms of like the relationship to place. And when we see sort of like extractive practices in relation to peoples, maybe not everybody has like that direct relationship with these types of beings. And I was wondering if your talk touched on this idea, Erin, and if you could sort of like expand on that, if there's sort of like a racialized aspect of that relationship that is missed for some folks, that maybe folks who are more privileged can experience more readily. Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to that, Erin.
Thank you so much for that question, Zach. I do actually think that our experience with nature is incredibly racialized. Like the idea that that people do not see nature outside of possessive logics, I think is incorrect, because this is an idea that I've been playing with for like the past few weeks, actually. So enslaved people were in fact property. They did not have the ability to own anything. So how then can property engage with other property, meaning land? How does property engage with itself? So in that regard, for people who have not been able to access this idea of possession, their experience with nature has been inherently different. It has to be more in the line of, this is land that I care for and that cares for me, or something in that regard that is inherently racialized. And it's also gendered, I would note. Because especially whenever we're talking about ownership in the United States, it would be ownership of like by white men.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We've reached the time for this panel, but I think that these are themes and questions and conversations that we should continue thinking about as this conference goes on and as we continue our academic work. And I just want to extend a really big thank you to Erin, Tyler, and Natasha for your wonderful presentations this morning. And thank you all for your attention and your interaction, even through the Zoom difficulties. I really appreciate you all still joining. And right now we'll be moving to lunch. So during lunch, you're free to take personal time without attending via Zoom, which is like totally fine. But if you want to connect to other attendees, you can use the link bank to join a lunch table. And these tables are an informal gathering space for attendees to meet each other and talk about a sub-theme that they care about. And they're generally unmoderated. So I'll be in one of them, but I won't be leading discussion. And then if we are able to see you after lunch, we'll see you at 12:45 p.m. to hear from a panel of local and interreligious speakers. And I'm going to copy the links in the chat right now, so everyone has them. But yes, thank you so much to everyone in this session. And I will hopefully see you down the line in the conference in another room.